Okay, hi everyone. My name is William Castillo. I'm an attorney in the US. I currently practice in San Francisco, but I also have experience practicing in New York City. Um, Thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you all in this very difficult time. My understanding is that a lot of you have some connection to Ukraine, either family there, or you yourself are from Ukraine, or you just want more information for people you may know that are in Ukraine, either in the US or in Europe or anywhere in the world. So, you know, before we start everything, my heartfelt, my heart really is very heavy from everything that is going on. And just know that um, I will give you all information today as best as I can. Please ask your questions in the chat box as it comes along, because this talk is really for you guys. What I'm going to talk about could be an entire course at a university, but I want to focus it on what information you guys think is more helpful for your situations. And Vida, please feel free to also chime in with questions. So, so a few things before we begin about my background. So I have experience working in Tajikistan, providing services to Afghan refugees who had crossed from Afghanistan into Tajikistan. I lived there for about a year. And I've also worked in Central America, in Guatemala and El Salvador, working with refugees who flee to the US. So what's really interesting right now is that it has been many, many years since we've had a refugee crisis originating from Europe. So I take it that a lot of you have family or friends in Ukraine. And given that, from the chat, I see that a lot of you are, or almost all of you are based in the US. A lot of you may be wondering, what can I do? I'm in the US. How can I bring people here? What's going to happen to people abroad that want to come to the US? And some of you may even be thinking, well, I'm Ukrainian, I'm in the US. Is there anything I can do? So I'm going to cover those issues separately. We're going to start with abroad. So in terms of refugees abroad, a lot of you may have seen that some countries have said we're welcoming refugees. Please know that under asylum law, international asylum law, which all EU states are party to, it is not illegal to approach a border and request refugee status. And some of you might hear me say asylum. Some of you might hear me say refugee. They're the same thing, but a little bit differently. A refugee is someone who is fleeing their country and they have not yet made it to the other country. An asylum seeker or an asylee is already in the country. So sometimes you will hear that, for example, a Ukrainian living in the US, they will be considered an asylee if they are granted asylum. But if they are outside of the US, they will be considered a refugee. But for our purposes, this is essentially the same thing. So you may have heard that a lot of different countries in Europe have said that they are welcoming Ukrainian refugees into their country, albeit with different requirements. I did read that Slovakia is now allowing Ukrainians to enter their country without having any necessary papers. Previously, countries like Poland and Romania and Moldova did allow Ukrainians to enter the country as refugees, but only provided that they had Ukrainian documents. And what happens is some people might not even have a passport. If you're Ukrainian and you've never left the country, you might have a national ID card, but you don't have a passport to leave the country. There is some talk going on within German politics about also creating a program to welcome Ukrainian refugees. They were known most famously in 2015 for allowing up to 1 million Syrian refugees to seek asylum in Germany. So there are a lot of eyes to keep a lookout for in the coming days to see if Germany is going to create such a program. Presently, you've seen that Poland is really leading the way, Romania, Moldova, and now Slovakia. So the EU also has its own asylum system. And this is very important for you to all know, especially if you all have family in Europe and in Ukraine. The way that asylum law works in the European Union is that you have to apply for asylum in the first country that you enter. So what does this mean? You know, if someone enters the EU and the first country that they enter is the UK, they can't then go to France and apply for asylum in France. So this is also, you know, something for you all to be aware of. For example, you might see a situation where, you know, let's say you have family members in France and you have family members in Ukraine that are trying to reunite with that family member in France. It can be tricky because the asylum process, if they stop in, let's say, what's another EU country? Switzerland, right? First, they take a flight, right, into Switzerland. They're going to have to apply for asylum in Switzerland. Now, there are requirements. There are certain exceptions to that where you can show that it is not feasible to apply for asylum within that first country that you enter. But again, those are exceptions, and there are, you know, you would have to consult with a lawyer within that European country to find that out. So that's also something to keep in mind. You know, some of you may be thinking, how can I get my family out? How can I get them to a different part of the continent? And I think it's really seeing, you know, where can they go first that is a non-EU country, potentially, and fly from there to the European country, the EU country that they wish to apply for asylum. So, for example, this was an issue with a lot of refugees from the Syrian civil war and from the Mediterranean who would initially arrive in either Greece or Cyprus or Italy. They were then told they could only apply for asylum in that country. But a lot of them were saying, hey, you know, I have family in the Netherlands or in France and Belgium. I'm trying to get there. And they would unfortunately say, sorry, you have to stay in Italy, apply for asylum in Italy, and wait for your decision there. The advantage is, you know, you get asylum in Italy, you are still able, you know, you become an EU citizen, you're able to travel within the EU, but, you know, you will have to remain in that country for that time. So that's, you know, the quick and dirty version of refugee law, at least in Europe. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? And you can just...
Like, let me talk for a second. It's recording. Девочки, всем привет. Я просто хотела поздороваться и сказать привет. Так что я вас не слышу, так как вы в наушниках у него. Но всем удачи, я побежала. Все, пока.
Спасибо, Зарина. Девочки, чтобы вы понимали, мальчики, я уже смотрю, присоединяются. Зарина – это жена Уильяма, и Зарина предоставила такую вот помощь нам, бесплатную. Sorry, I'm just saying, you know.
Okay. Yes,
Zarina gave graciously offered this help of William. William is donating his time now to consult, to talk about, you know, what it takes to immigrate somewhere. And thank you so much for covering Europe too, because obviously it's the closest to Ukraine right now, and really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
I have a question. Is anyone here in Canada by any chance? Do you know, Vita?
I think that from what I'm seeing from the names that I know, mostly those are in the US, but I wouldn't be surprised if some people are in Canada too, just because we do, our group is for Canada and the US. So
okay, let me just say a few words about Canada for those of you who know Ukrainians living in Canada. So this will just be very brief. Canada has a program called Canadian Refugee Resettlement, and that allows you to sponsor a refugee from anywhere in the world, but you will need a group of 5 individuals who will be able to prove to the Canadian government that they can provide financial support to a refugee family for up to 2 years. And if they are allowed into that program, the Canadian government will also provide a stipend, housing, and a lot of social services. So the reason I'm saying this is if you know of Ukrainian families that are already living as citizens in Canada, they can inquire into the Canadian Refugee Resettlement Program so long as the family that they want to sponsor lives safely in another country in the world. And they would be applying for Canadian Refugee Resettlement at the local Canadian embassy or consulate where the family is. So just keep that in mind. That is one of the few programs in the world that allows people, everyday people, to give refugees a chance to come to the US. So there, Natalia is asking, how can US citizens support the asylum seeker? Does it help to write letters for the family to include in the application? So that's a great question. I'm going to back up a little bit before I answer your question, Natalia. I want to discuss what the asylum process is in the United States and what all of you can do, especially if you are thinking of trying to get your families to come to the US. So in order to apply for asylum in the US, you have to physically be present either at the US, inside of the US, or at a border with the US. And this is the hard part. The US is almost like a little island. We only have Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. So very few people cross from the Canadian border into the US. The majority of asylum seekers travel from Mexico or they enter the country through a visa. So let me cover those two things. If you have family members who already have a visa into the US, they can fly into the US and apply for asylum immediately. Okay? If they don't have a visa to the US, they just need to get here somehow. Okay? And there's a very important difference here that I want to talk to you about with regards to immigration law. There are two ways to apply for asylum in the United States. The first is at what is called the asylum office. This is just an office, it looks just like mine, and you walk in, there's no judge, no nothing. You just file your application with the asylum office. There's a person like me, they're dressed very casually. They ask the person questions. Why are you a refugee? Why are you fleeing your country? And if you're granted asylum, you're told 2 weeks later, and that is that. However, if you are not granted asylum at the asylum office, and if you currently don't have status in the United States to legally be here, you are then placed in what are called removal proceedings. This is basically a deportation proceeding in immigration court. Once your case is sent to immigration court, you have an opportunity to apply for asylum again, but this time it's going to be in front of a judge. So you basically have 2 times. So that is the process at the asylum office. The other process is in immigration court. You apply for asylum in immigration court if you somehow ended up in immigration court. And the way that asylum seekers end up in immigration court is if they attempted to cross the border or they presented themselves at the border saying that they are an asylum seeker. They are allowed into the country in order to apply for asylum, but if they do not win asylum at the immigration court, they will receive an order of deportation. This is also the same process for individuals who currently do not have status inside of the US. So that's a very important distinction to know. Some of you may be wondering, I have friends who are Ukrainian, they want to apply for asylum. What can they do? The other really important thing to know, there's a very strict requirement in asylum law in the United States. And if you take anything from this today, is that you have to apply for asylum in the United States within 1 year of having entered into the US. So an example, someone came a year ago on a tourist visa and they just overstayed their visa. They are still here. They have to request asylum before 1 year goes by, okay? So within the United States, some people may already be in immigration court proceedings, or you may know about Ukrainians that are already in immigration court. They can apply for asylum, even if they had never applied for asylum before, and even if they had previously applied for asylum under a different reason. And the reason is that right now there's something called changed circumstances in Ukraine. The conditions of the country have changed so significantly that even if you were previously denied asylum, or even if you applied for a different reason for asylum, you can now make a new claim based on a new set of facts, which is the invasion by Russia, okay? So let me get back to the question that Natalia asked, which is how can US citizens support the asylum seeker? Does it help to write letters for the family to include in the application? And so the answer for that will be yes and no. And it really depends what the family is applying for. In asylum, it helps to write letters for people to show that they are credible people. What happens a lot in asylum cases is that the testimony the individual gives is sometimes the only evidence that exists. So family members and friends can write letters to say that this person that is applying for asylum is trustworthy, or if it's your family member, it's your brother or your mother or your grandmother, you can just say what you know about their situation. For example, at this point, it doesn't matter where you are from in Ukraine. It's not just people in Donetsk or Lugansk. It's going to be anyone living in Ukraine is in danger. And it doesn't matter what part of Ukraine you go back to, you will face a likelihood of persecution, okay? So let me get back to some of the questions here. Can a person ask for asylum in any European country? My mother, LPR, is going to Moldova with no visa. So one second. So in terms of asking for like a sort of emergency visa or a traveling visa to enter the US, there is no such visa. You have to get it like a tourist visa or any visa really that you can get your hands on to come into the US. But you know, you said oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, Livgenia, you said your mother is a legal permanent resident. So yes, as a legal permanent resident, she, so long as she has evidence of her green card, she can immediately come to the United States. But your sister, who doesn't have a visa, there is no such emergency visa. Unfortunately, the case for your sister is that your sister has to wait somewhere outside of the US. And what, you know, in situations like this, it's very important for you to speak to an immigration attorney. I can speak to you afterwards about that, depending on where you live, because it's all going to depend on the age of your sister and whether your mother can still petition your sister for permanent residency. Okay, so feel free to message me as well about that. Okay, so another question from Maria. Can a person who doesn't speak English ask about translator or bring relatives to the asylum office? That is a great question. So as I mentioned, the asylum office, it's just a regular office, just like this. There's no judge. It's not in court. But you do have to bring an interpreter with you. It could be a relative. It could be a family friend. but I do recommend that it is someone who is very fluent in both languages, because I have been to many asylum officer hearings, and I have heard many stories where the asylum officer hears something different because of the interpreter. So when you're talking about telling your story, it's very important to have someone who can really convey in English exactly what the applicant is saying. So just keep that in mind. And the asylum officer is also going to have someone on the phone who's going to be checking the quality of the interpretation, but that's not always good. You may have someone, I'll give you an example. If someone is from a rural village in Ukraine, they may have lower levels of education and they may speak a dialect of Russian, or they may speak solely Ukrainian or prefer speaking Ukrainian. And the interpreter is a Russian speaker from, Siberia, and is not familiar with a lot of the language that the applicant uses. So this may cause some confusion during the process. So, it's really important for you to find a good interpreter if that happens. What is really important for you all to know as well is in the United States, there are 9 asylum offices, and there are multiple immigration courts. And the quality of those asylum offices and immigration courts really varies. Okay, to give you an example, the San Francisco Asylum Office has certain officers whose grant rate is about 70 or 80%. And this is of all applicants. San Francisco's Asylum Office is known as being one of the most generous in terms of granting asylum. In immigration courts, similarly, in immigration courts in Oregon, in Seattle, in San Francisco, the certain judges have a grant rate of up to 90% of asylum cases. So you compare this with immigration courts and asylum offices in states like Florida, Georgia, and Texas, which have some of the lowest grant rates in the entire country. Some immigration judges in Texas have grant rates of 5% to 10%, meaning that they are denying 90% of cases. And the same is for certain immigration judges in Georgia. For some of you, you might know a lot of people living in New York. And in New York, the asylum office, there is an asylum office in New Jersey, and there is one in New York. The New Jersey one is pretty decent. The New York one is okay. It's hit or miss. The immigration court, there are several immigration courts in New York City. There is one called the Varick Street Immigration Court, and that presently is a very good court for asylum seekers. I will speak about New York specifically right now, because there may be a lot of you who have family in New York who may be in removal proceedings, or you may wish to bring family members to reunite to New York City. The process presently in New York City is that if you arrived into the US after May of last year, you will be given priority with your immigration court hearing. You can have your hearing within about 6 months to a year. And the judges there are presently very fair and very welcoming towards refugees. If that is not the case, you can see several years, between 2 and 5 years, of a wait in an immigration court to have your case heard. So there is the question here from Italia: is there a cap for the U.S. to let refugees in? Would Ukrainians be given a priority today? This is an excellent question. And this gets back to the difference that I mentioned to you all earlier between a refugee and an asylum seeker. A refugee, as a reminder, is someone who is outside of the country, wishing to receive protection inside of another country. An asylum seeker is someone who is presently inside of a country like the US, asking for protection. So in terms of the US letting refugees in, this refers to people who are outside of the country. The US does have a refugee system, and that is capped at an annual number every year. Before the Trump administration, that number was 110,000 per year. And all you had to do was go to your nearest US embassy anywhere in the world and apply for refugee status there. What happened during the Trump administration is that the number went from 110,000 to 40,000, which was the lowest in 30 years. The Biden administration has raised it only modestly. I believe the number is about 60,000 right now. But that refugee process of applying at a US embassy abroad is extremely slow and requires many years of vetting. So that is only recommended for Ukrainians or people who are currently living in a country that has a US embassy and they are safely able to live there. They may have status there, or they may be living illegally in that country without status, but that's a separate program. Now, for Ukrainians that are in the United States or that present themselves at the border, there is no such limit at all. And this is both helpful in the sense that there is no limit, but it also leads to delays in immigration courts and asylum offices when there are multiple people currently coming into the US and presenting themselves at the border. So this ties in nicely to the question that Elena asked, which is, does it make sense to try to cross the border in Mexico and try to go to America if people don't have visas? Will they be able to apply for refugee status? So that is a great question. And, you know, I cannot advise you all to tell people to cross the border, but what I can tell you is the reality of what happens on the ground. My understanding is that Mexico is very generous with giving tourist visas to people from post-Soviet states, to people from European countries. So in terms of crossing the border in Mexico, that is an option. It's just important to understand the risks involved with that. I used to practice immigration law at Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New York and New York City. And this was in 2018 until 2020. And during that time, I worked with multiple clients who were Russian speakers who had crossed the border from Mexico. And this included families from Central Asia, families from Chechnya, for example. And a lot of them would arrive in Cancun on tourist visas, and they would take a bus that would take them to the border. They would arrange that. I don't know how, but it's possible to do that. It is a very difficult trip. The risks are that northern Mexico is currently controlled by various criminal enterprises, cartels, and a lot of them use refugees for smuggling purposes, for extortion, and also for violence. So this is a situation where people do this out of last resort. It is not something that is ideal. It is something that is very dangerous. And if someone does decide to go through with it, you know, if you have a family member that says, hey, I'm going to go to Mexico, I'm going to try to approach the US border, please have a backup plan. They need to memorize the phone numbers of multiple people, because if one day they lose all of their belongings, they need to have a way to contact family members. You need to have a plan of every day I'm going to contact you with this. They need to, know how to steer clear of danger. They need to go with people that they can trust, because it is very dangerous. So that being said, what happens when you reach the border? During the Trump administration, he created a program that put anyone that presented themselves at the border into refugee camps inside of northern Mexico. And it wasn't really camps, it was mostly telling people to just wait in Mexico. So this resulted in slums being built in parks in Mexican cities at the border, with asylum seekers waiting there for years. The Biden administration has stopped that program. It now only applies to a certain number of people, not to everyone. So the risk of someone being told to wait in Mexico at a camp has now been reduced. However, there is still the possibility that if a family presents themselves, they might not be allowed into the US. But given the political situation, I think my theory, and this is just my personal opinion, is that the US would be allowing Ukrainian refugees through the border. So what happens after that? You present yourself to a border guard at the border. You explain to them that you fear returning to your country. At that point, the person is allowed to enter into the United States. They're allowed to shower. They will be placed in a room that is called the ice box. And the conditions at the border are atrocious. There are numerous human rights violations. And it's about, preparing yourself for that. It is not a welcoming place. And I have been to the border. I have been to the shelters across the border, and you are placed in what is called an ice box. And the purpose of that is to supposedly get rid of any microbes that you may have that you picked up through the journey. So it's a room that has a concrete floor, and it is extremely cold. And you must be there for, I think, 24 hours, sometimes longer. And there are lights that are on the entire time. They never turn off. You're getting a small little mattress to sleep in, and you have to be there. Once you're processed out of that, if you are coming with children and you're a woman, you may be placed in a temporary detention facility for women and children. Most likely, you may be told to just come back. Most likely, you will be told to check in with immigration once you reach your city of destination. So a lot of people, they're let go. They say, okay, now you can leave the border. You can go to wherever you need to in the US. And once you get there, you need to check in with immigration services so that they can register you with the local immigration court so that your court proceedings can begin. And at those court proceedings, that's where you'll be applying for asylum. One important thing to note is that once you leave the ice box, you will be speaking to an officer who does a preliminary intake to determine whether you fear returning to your country. And it's very important there for the individual to indicate that they fear returning to their country, because if the person there finds that the person doesn't fear returning to their country, they will be denied and sent back into Mexico. Some people get confused because they have that interview and they think that that was their asylum interview, and it's not. That is just a preliminary intake to make sure that the individual presented themselves at the border to seek asylum and nothing else. Okay, I have another question from Vitalia. While you're waiting for your case to be considered approved, could you work in the United States? Yes. This has become more strict under the Trump administration. Previously, the system was that you could get a work permit pretty soon after applying for asylum. That has now changed. Now you're allowed to work so long as you applied within 1 year of entering the United States and that you have caused no delays in the court proceeding. This is an area of law that is changing, but tentatively, yes, you can get permission to work in the United States so long as you follow certain rules. Okay, a question from Helen. What about flying to another country with a connection in the USA? Will there be a chance to ask for refugee status? This is tricky because if you're talking about a connection in the United States, this is something that is not always allowed, because in order to do that, you have to go to customs. If you're taking a connecting flight, it means that you're not allowed to exit the airport. However, people do this. People do ask for refugee status at the airport. My experience has been that the immigration officers at the airport are a little harsher when it comes to this. So I cannot give more information about whether that is a good idea or whether that is something that is likely to happen. So then Vitaly is asking, do you need a lawyer to file for refugee status? How much does it cost? So this is a very good question. This is all going to depend on where you live. You can do the application by yourself, the initial application, but it's very important to have an attorney review it. If you live in New York City, you can contact there's a hotline for Catholic Charities New York, and there is a program that provides free assistance for people to file their application within the 1 year. They will not represent you in an asylum case, but they will represent you in helping you fill out that application so you meet that deadline. So let me give you all that phone number for those of you who are in New York. Actually, Vida, I'm going to have to give you that link because I have to get it from my friend. She's the managing attorney for that program. One important thing to note, there is a lot of fraud in the immigration system by attorneys, okay? And I have observed this firsthand because a lot of clients would come to me because someone else messed up their case, okay? What do I mean by that? Private attorneys will sometimes lie to their clients. It's very unethical. And they will tell them that they have a great shot at a case and certain things. And they will then demand very, very large sums of money for help in an immigration case. So if you have someone coming to you and saying, hey, you know, I'll do your asylum case, pay me $20,000, that is not right. There are free legal services. There are multiple services available for refugees and asylum seekers in the United States. This is all going to depend on where you live. If you live in a major city, you're more likely to have access to those legal services. But even if you don't, the important thing to note is go to multiple attorneys. Don't go to only the first one that you talk to. Have them compete with each other. The same way that when you go and buy a car, you don't buy a car from just the first car dealership that you go to. You go to multiple ones, and then you go to one and you say, hey, you know, the other person is charging me $5,000 less than you. Make it so that you are not being taken advantage of, because a lot of immigration attorneys take advantage of the fact that people, especially refugees, are in a desperate situation, and a lot of them don't have money. That is the truth. So if you are in New York City, there are multiple services there. If you need information about services in the Bay Area or New York City, New Jersey, please let me know as well. There is no fee to apply for asylum, although I do have to double check that. It might have changed, but and that is the same whether you apply for asylum in immigration court or at the asylum office. Okay, is there any, and Julia asks, is there any changes the US can make to their immigration law to make it easier for Ukrainians to get asylum? Do you anticipate such changes? This is a good question. So this is getting at what are the requirements for asylum. Just very quickly, I will explain to you. So in order to qualify for asylum, you have to show that there is a likelihood that you will be persecuted upon return to your country because of your race, your religion, your national origin, your political opinion, or because you're a member of a specific group in that society. So the strength of an asylum case is going to depend on those factors. When a war such as this one breaks out, it is likely that almost everyone can provide some sort of reason why they qualify into one of those. But just know that you need to speak with an immigration attorney because it's not 100%. And I'll give you an example. Afghanistan has been in war for several decades now. But in representing asylum seekers from Afghanistan inside of the United States, not all of them are granted asylum. Why is that? What you would think, how can you deport someone to Afghanistan? And the reason is, it's going to depend on the credibility of the person, of the evidence that they presented, and it's going to depend on their particular circumstances. So if, you know, this situation with the present war, the difference is that everyone seems to be a target. It seems like the nationality is the piece, the most important piece, because it seems like people are being targeted because they are Ukrainian. That's it. And then people are also being targeted because they support Ukraine. So this would be for someone, you know, with who's, let's say, ethnically Russian, living in Ukraine and has Ukrainian citizenship. They can still argue they are being persecuted because of their support, political support for Ukraine. So presently, I don't think that any changes need to be made to the asylum system itself, because I think the present war shows that Putin is trying to target the Ukrainian nationality as a whole. And so long as you fall under that nationality, and that means you have a Ukrainian passport, then I think there's a possibility of receiving asylum that way. I will note an important change that many immigrants' rights groups have been, many changes that immigrants' rights groups have been pushing the Biden administration to do. And this is to implement a system called temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is not asylum, but it allows you to work in the United States and not be deported. So temporary protected status is given to large groups of people whose home country has been ravaged by war, or there's a natural disaster. So as an example, the current administration granted temporary protected status to all people from Venezuela who are presently in the United States, because it is too dangerous to return to Venezuela under the current rule of Nicolas Maduro. So it is anticipated that the Biden administration will grant temporary protected status to all Ukrainians living in the United States. If that happens, we might have another discussion here. We can have another call to see how to apply for temporary protected status. And just know you can apply for both. You can apply for temporary protected status and asylum, but temporary protected status is a much, much quicker change. And then another question from Julia: what kind of documents should asylum seekers present to confirm that there's a threat to their life, given Ukraine's current situation? Well, it's going to depend on the circumstances. You know, I think because it's very new, the conflict is very, very new. I think right now, you know, just showing that you're Ukrainian seems like that would be evidence enough. However, it's really going to be important to talk to an immigration attorney to see if that person fits into the other categories, right? So I'll give you some examples. There's race, right? Let's say you have darker skin, or you are mixed race, or you are of African descent, and there's another additional reason why you may be persecuted in Russia. That will help the application. Let's say the other one is a nationality. We covered that. The other one is political opinion. Let's say you just oppose the war. I mean, that's pretty simple. Political opinion doesn't mean that you have to have been a member of an opposition party. It just means that you hold sincere beliefs that are against the occupying force, which is Russia. And the other one, there are different things based on employment, right? For example, if you're a police officer, or if you lived in Donetsk, or if you lived in Lugansk, right? There are many specific situations that could strengthen an application, but at this time, given that Russia is presenting itself as an occupying force, really it's about just proving that you are Ukrainian. But that's something to discuss with an immigration attorney. So there's another question from Vitalia. Can you apply for asylum in Canada and then go and apply in the US to strengthen your chances? That is, I'm glad you asked that, Vitalia. So there is an agreement with between the US and Canada with regards to asylum, which basically says you have to apply for asylum in the first country that you land. So if you first land in Canada, you have to apply for asylum in Canada, and you are then barred from applying for asylum in the United States. Similarly, if you land in the United States, or you enter into the United States, you cannot then go into Canada and apply for asylum. You will be denied and told to apply in the United States. The thing that happens is that it's a lot harder to get into Canada. So, the Canadian refugee system, I will say, is much, much better. It's much more lenient than the US immigration system. So again, like what I've told you, if you have friends in Canada that need to reunite with family members, we can have a discussion offline about that. It's a separate system, but their system is much more generous than the US. Okay, someone asked, can you speak more about cases for relatives that are crossing the border at this time? Should they seek a B1, B2 visa, that is a tourist or a business visa, and then ask for a refugee or asylum at the airport, or should you apply after you get to your destination in the US? Good question. If someone has a tourist visa or a business visa, or really any visa to enter the United States, they do not need to apply for asylum at the airport. They should leave the airport and they should go to their destination. They should reunite and they should apply to the closest asylum office to them. And there are only 9 asylum offices in the country, so you can speak to an immigration attorney nearby to find out what is the closest one to you. But as I had mentioned earlier, it is quite risky in my experience, and I'm not too familiar with it, but it's not really advised to request asylum at the airport, although that is something that you can do if it is like a last resort. But if you have the option of leaving the airport because you already have a visa, it's much better to reunite with family and to make sure that you apply for asylum within 1 year of that date that you entered the country. That is very crucial. There's one thing that I want to mention quickly. Not everyone can apply for asylum. And this is really key because everything that I just told you, there are multiple exceptions. And one to note is if the individual has a criminal record for certain crimes back in their home country, or if they themselves have participated in persecution at any time in the past. Okay, so to give you a very easy example, right? If someone is applying for asylum and they are from Afghanistan, okay, and they say, well, but actually, 5 years ago, I was actually a Taliban soldier, but now I'm no longer a Taliban soldier. That is going to potentially prevent that individual from receiving asylum, because they will be considered to have engaged in the persecution of others. So this is why it's important to speak to an immigration attorney to make sure that no exceptions apply to you. And even if an exception does apply, to see if there are any ways to still receive some sort of status in the United States. One other thing to note, if you receive asylum in the United States, it doesn't matter if it is through the asylum office or through immigration court. Asylum is granted to you and your entire family, even if only one person applies. As an example, if a mother applies for asylum and she has 2 kids here and 1 kid currently waiting in Poland with her father, her husband, if she is granted asylum here in the US, she will then be able to bring all of her family members, by family members, I mean children and spouse, bring them to the US as refugees. Okay. In order to do that, they will have to show that relationship. So right now, tell your family in Ukraine, the most important thing you can have are documents showing family connections, showing that this is my husband, this is my wife, these are my children, because this is going to be key. If one of them ever gets asylum in the United States, they will need to prove that relationship. If the family members are in the United States, they will automatically and immediately also receive refugee status and asylum status. And they will be able to immediately work in the United States. And after a few years, they will be able to apply for permanent residency. Okay. Anastasia, you sent me a direct message. Let's talk about that. I will stay on afterwards. If you could just stay and we can discuss that in more detail. Okay, so Victoria says, here's a situation. If my relative can cross the border of Poland and reach the US Embassy, and I will there too, could my relative be allowed to apply for asylum at the embassy and border flight with me to the US? So the answer for that is actually no, because as I mentioned earlier, the only way that someone can be flown into the United States as a refugee is if the embassy has determined that they are a refugee allowed to have refugee status. Again, that's something that could potentially change, although I'm not sure they will implement a program where you apply directly. This would only be possible if, let's say, your relative goes to Poland, remains in Poland, and applies through the refugee application process at the US Embassy there. However, that is something that, right now, there are no details about how to do that, or whether there's going to be another system. So again, that is something, even if you are there. Here's an example. So Victoria, getting to this question, right? I think right now it's about thinking creatively. I think if you are there with your relative in Poland and you can provide some sort of support to that relative for some time, can you apply for a tourist visa? Because it might be a situation where, and this, it's pure speculation. I don't know if this is going to happen, but it may be a situation where the US grants tourist visas to Ukrainians. And that will just allow you to fly and apply for asylum once you reach here. But at this point, given the urgency and how quickly things are changing, the important thing is to just make sure that your relatives are safe and they have somewhere that they can be while different countries announce the way that they are going to respond to this crisis. But Victoria, we can talk about that in more detail as well, just kind of to think through ideas. Okay, and Katerina says, if I had asylum originally, now I'm a citizen, can I still use this to bring my family? Yes. So this is going to depend on which family members. So if you are a citizen, if you are a permanent resident in the United States, you can bring to the US certain family members, some more quickly than others. The quickest are going to be your children who are under 21 years old at the time that the application to bring them was submitted, and also your spouse. You can also bring your parents. It's much faster if you're a citizen. You can bring your parents. There's no age restriction for your parents. They could be as old or as young as they are. And it takes some time, and it's not an extremely quick process. It could take a few months, it could take a year, it could take more. And that's something where it's really important to speak to an immigration attorney to talk specifically about the requirements and how to do that. Okay, and then Anastasia says, how long should you wait for a refugee status, and what status do you get after a court decision? So that's a good question. So if you apply for asylum in the asylum office, the way that it works is you will likely get an interview within a few months. And this is going to depend on how busy the asylum office is where you currently live. So when I practiced in New York, sometimes the wait was 2 months from the time the application was submitted to the date of the interview. Other times it took 6 months, 7 months. It's really kind of random. There are other times where the asylum office tries to respond to specific refugee crises and will prioritize certain cases. For example, they may prioritize cases where there are children, or certain emergency cases as well. Really speak to an attorney about that. But whether you're granted asylum in the asylum office or whether you're granted that in court, the status that you have after that is asylee. An asylee just means someone who has received asylum. And once you have had asylee status for 1 year, after 1 year, you can then apply for a green card. So you can remain in asylee. Some people remain in asylee status for many years. They just kind of forget to apply for permanent residency. But really, apply for permanent residency as soon as possible. After 3 or 4 years, depending on your specific situation, you can then apply for citizenship. And once you have citizenship, no one can take that away from you. Although I shouldn't say no one, there are very limited circumstances where they should, but they don't apply to most people. Someone asked, what states do I practice in? I'm currently an attorney in California. I'm licensed in New York and California. It's important for you all to know, let me make this comment here. It's important for you to know that immigration law is federal. So it's generally the same in every state. The one thing I will tell you all is do not go to notaries. This is especially important because especially within the Russian-speaking community, a lot of people believe that notaries can act like attorneys, because in some countries, notaries are usually attorneys. That's not the case in the United States. Notaries get a license to put stamps and verify identity. They're not lawyers. But a lot of people do take advantage of this, and they trick people into thinking, if you ever see a sign that says notary, immigration services, it's a big red flag. If you're an immigration attorney, you advertise your immigration services. You don't advertise your notary services. And the reason I tell you all this is that notary, or you might run into people. I have had clients, Russian-speaking clients in New York, who come to me and they say, oh, you know, my asylum application was denied, or this happened. Show me the papers. And they show me the papers. And I said, who did this for you? Oh, it's this woman. She's a Russian speaker. She did this for my friend, and my friend got a green card, and this and this and that. And I just paid her a little bit of money, and I went to her house, and she helped me fill it out. I said, okay, is that woman an attorney? Oh, I don't know what she is, but you know, she's done it for a lot of my friends, you know, et cetera, et cetera. That woman forgot to check off a box. And because she forgot to check off that box, it created a whole lot of problems for the case. They might also tell you to lie. They might also tell you to add certain facts to make your case stronger. And just so you all know, at this point, there's no reason to lie. Sometimes people lie because they think it's going to make their case stronger. You know, people tell them, oh, tell them that, you know, your house was bombed, or tell them that this and this and that. You know, remember that the asylum officer is also checking for your credibility. And if they suspect anything, that could lead to the denial of an asylum application, even if it seems like it is a strong case. If the asylum officer or the immigration court judge doesn't believe you, it doesn't matter how great of a story you have. So please be on the lookout for immigration attorneys that want to take advantage of you, and also for people who are not attorneys. And look, I know that this is very difficult because sometimes there are just not many attorneys that speak Russian. And sometimes you will feel more familiar, you will feel more comfortable with an attorney who speaks Russian, or he has staff that speaks Russian, and I get it. So here's something every single person here in this group can do. I worked at a nonprofit office. We did not charge any of our clients for money. One time, one of my clients comes and he pulls out his wallet. He said, Will, thank you so much. And he's trying to give me $100. And I say, I can't take that. My organization pays me so that you don't have to pay me. You don't have to do anything like that. So what I am going to tell all of you here, every single person here, no matter your ability in English, you can help. You can be an interpreter. Because what tends to happen is attorneys don't have enough interpreters. One time we got a ton of people from Uzbekistan who only spoke Russian. For some reason, they all just came all at once, and we only had one person who can interpret for us. And you can all right now help with that. You can find local nonprofits near you that provide services to refugees. And even if it's one time a month, even if you only do it one time in your life, this is something that you can do. And this is going to make a huge help. And you know what? When I have people, when I have clients, and some of them just crossed the border, they're tired. They tell me I came last week. I've been walking for 2 months in Mexico. And then they meet their interpreter, and the interpreter is from the same country. They get very happy to see, you know, a familiar face, someone speaking their language, someone who's already inside of this country, who's been here and can speak in the same language. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so there's another question from Evgenia. That was my biggest question. How I understand it is the best idea now to try tourist visa for relatives and then change status in the United States. Correct? Yes, if you have relatives that are able to get a tourist visa or any visa to come to the US, that is going to be the most ideal way to then request asylum in the United States. So certainly if that's something you can do, I would recommend it. So Vitalia says, you recommended to shop around for an immigration attorney. On average, from your experience, what could it cost for one person? It's really going to depend on the complexity of the case. You know, some cases are easy, some are difficult. You know, it could be $5,000. It could be $3,000, $2,000. It's really going to depend on the individual. I'll give you an example. If someone comes to an office and says, I want to apply for asylum, the first thing the attorney will say is, great, when did you enter the US? Okay, I entered last week. All right, that lets me know that we have almost a year to prepare the application, okay? And you can charge, you know, a regular rate. If a person comes to me and says, hi, I want to apply for asylum, I entered the United States almost 1 year ago. Oh, really? Yeah, actually, this Friday, it's going to be 1 year. That's an emergency situation. And it happens. It's an emergency situation, and the attorney needs to really focus on preparing the application. One important thing, when I say application, it doesn't mean your evidence. You don't have to submit all your evidence with that initial application. You just have to fill out a long form with a lot of questions. But you present your evidence at the time of your interview in the asylum office or at the time of your hearing in immigration court. So a lot of people come and they say, I need to apply for asylum in a few days. I don't have all my evidence ready. And I say, well, you don't have to submit your evidence right now. That's something that can wait. And if there is any evidence that is in Russian or Ukrainian, it does need to be translated. That's something that to keep in mind as well. Okay, so Vitalia said, could you share some organizations who might need help? Yeah, I'm going to type this into the chat. So, you know, I'm most familiar with New York. So that's going to be Catholic Charities New York. Actually, there's Catholic Charities of New York, of Brooklyn, and of Queens. There's Legal Aid Society. I'm typing this all in for you guys. Legal Aid Society. There's Human Rights First. There's the International Rescue Committee. And for San Francisco Bay Area, there's Bay Area Legal Aid. And the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. One other thing I'm going to type in for everyone here, you might wonder, well, okay, Will, you keep saying find an immigration attorney, talk to an immigration attorney, one who's not sketchy and has a notary sign out in front of their office. But how do you do that, right? So I just sent to you, I'm going to send to you guys a link. So this is www.AILA.org. This is the American Immigration Lawyers Association. It is a group of immigration attorneys. They have a feature on their website. You can go there and it says find an attorney. And you can search by language. You can search by state. Just because they're there on this website doesn't necessarily mean they're a good attorney. But this is something you need to do. Pretend you're buying a car. You're not just going to buy any car. Remember that you are in control. If you are getting an attorney, you are the one deciding who represents you. The attorney works for you. It's not the other way around. You don't work for them. So if you ever feel like your attorney is pressuring you to do something, is rude to you, is mean to you, that's not right. And you can report them to the state bar where they are licensed. And actually, here's a very important thing to know. How do you know if someone's an attorney? It's very easy, actually. You see my name here? With my name, you just type my name into Google, and you can see whether I'm licensed or not. If the person said, the first thing you want to ask them is, where are you licensed? If the person says, I'm licensed in New York, you go to Google and you type in New York attorney search. And there's a website that has the names of every single attorney licensed in New York. And this is the same for any state across the country. This is a public list. And when you type in the name of the person there, it's going to tell you where they work, when they receive their license, and whether their license is currently suspended, or whether they are eligible to practice law. So you can do this with my name. You can enter it. You can type California attorney search. There's a search bar. You put in my name. I pop up in New York. So sometimes people tell me, hey, that this person told me he was an attorney, and then it turns out he wasn't. So just remember, be vigilant. Please look out. Try to make sure that you are talking to someone who is authorized to help you. Okay, there is another question from Natalia. Do I understand it correctly that for US citizens, it's more difficult to help a brother or sister to rejoin the family or very direct relation? Yes. So I did forget to discuss brothers and sisters. If you're a citizen or permanent resident, you can petition brothers and sisters, but that's going to be about a 14-year wait currently. So that's not something immediate. That's something that, you apply for it, you forget about it, and 15 years later, you get a letter saying, hey, your brother can now come. So definitely I wish it wasn't like that. I wish that it was faster. Brothers and sisters are family, but unfortunately, there's no way to expedite that. Okay, Katerina, could our relatives be denied a tourist visa to the US because visa offers will assume that they will apply for asylum once they arrive here? It's a good question. Maybe, right? I think I had given the caveat earlier that I don't know if the US is going to grant tourist visas to Ukrainians right now, because they know that they're going to be applying for asylum. It's tricky. The thing is, I don't know. The only thing I will say is do not lie, because that is really where problems could arise. When you apply for asylum and you had already received a visa at an embassy, sometimes the asylum officer will have read the notes from the interview with the embassy staff. And the reason I say I don't know about this is because my experience with Venezuelans, the collapse in Venezuela really picked up in about 2017, 2018. There were a lot of protests against Nicolas Maduro. And the embassy was giving tourist visas to some people. Again, here, when you apply for a tourist visa, they're going to ask, what is the purpose of your visit? Is it for pleasure? If you say it's to apply for asylum, it's unlikely that they will give you the tourist visa. I think it's, keeping an eye out right now for whether anything is going to change. The advantage with applying for a visa is that if it's denied, nothing happens. There's no punishment. The only way that it could affect you is if you say something that is really wrong or incorrect at that interview, and you later come to the United States, and now there's a record that you told the embassy staff one thing, and now you're saying another thing. So as I'm telling you here, stay truthful, because you don't know what could potentially affect you in the future with an asylum application. Okay, Evgenia, if the refugee Evgenia, can you rewrite it? I'm not sure what you mean, whether relatives can transfer the case to another country. I'm not quite sure. If you could just re-type that one, that'd be great. Bateli is asking, Helen is asking, can a permanent resident reunite with the relatives from Ukraine easier now, taking in the current situation? Well, it depends. It really depends. If you are a permanent resident and you want to bring your relatives, your parents, your children under 21, or your spouse, this is going to depend on the circumstances because you're going to be working with the embassy. I'll give you all an example. The embassies may be able to process emergency situations, but it's really on a case-by-case basis. You see that a lot in situations where someone needs cancer treatment and they need to immediately undergo surgery within the next month, for example, and they have a pending permanent residency application, and there could be some ability to request from the embassy that they expedite the case. But again, this is going to be on a case-by-case situation. It's really going to depend. Otherwise, in terms of how long it will take, given the current situation, I really don't know. I wish I could give you an answer, but given that many people are going to be fleeing Ukraine, and they currently are, that's going to increase requests from people to bring family members here. So I don't know. So Evgeny says, if a refugee case is pending since 2020, but a number has not been given, what should be done? Best way to go, transfer the case to another country, apply for a tourist visa. So Evgeny, we can talk, I'll stay a little bit after to talk about that. There's no way to transfer the case to another country. If someone has applied for asylum in the United States and has not received a number, that's really about contacting the asylum office, or if it's an immigration court, to find out what's going on. Or if you're referring to someone applied for refugee status outside of the US, we can discuss that too. But again, that's really going to depend on some of the specifics of your particular situation. Okay, so I know I've told you all a lot of information, but it's really, if you take anything away, it's apply for asylum within 1 year, help your communities, help Russian speakers, help Ukrainians. There's a lot that you can do. And, I will say this, my family are refugees themselves from a brutal civil war in Central America. And the experience that you guys are living through and that your families are living through are not new for many people in the United States. So please be aware of those around you, to recognize that there are multiple refugee crises going on right now across the world, and to really provide assistance wherever you can, to kind of, view immigrants and refugees maybe in a different light, right? The person who's helping your groceries or driving your taxi has their own story. They may need help. And the only reason that my family is here in San Francisco, in the United States, is because my father, a few months after arriving to the United States by himself in 1991, he had only one pair of clothes, and he saw a guy picking up trash, and my dad went and helped him pick up some trash. My dad took off his shirt because it was his only shirt, and that man was the son of a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, and an owner of a construction company. And he immediately gave a job to my father. And my father ended up working for him for 15 years. And he's the one that helped my father bring me and my younger siblings to the United States. So when I first arrived at the airport in San Francisco, that man was there, his boss was there with a huge cowboy hat because he was from Texas, and his wife was there, his son was there. And, I think about that, they had no obligation to do this. They didn't have to help us. And for the next 20 years, they provided support to my family, helped us, learn English, help us really become members of society here. So, I always see a lot of value in doing that. And, just think of Venezuelans right now, they are suffering. Think of Haitians. Haitians are coming into the country. They are suffering. Syrians, Afghans, people from Mexico, women fleeing violence in Central America. There's just so much going on that is very similar to what is going on in Ukraine, although it takes different forms. And just, reach out, see who you can help. I'll stick around here. Vita, if anyone has questions or wants to chat, turn on your video, turn on your microphone. I'm happy to talk to you more.
William, thank you so much for sorry for donating your time today, and this has been incredibly helpful. And I know that a lot of us, like I have my mom who lives in a different country. She's in Mexico right now, but of course I want to bring her here. And this was incredibly great. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and advice, and sharing all the resources and the process and the steps that people need to take now. We really appreciate it, especially during this, these times. Thank you so much.
No problem. And thank you all for, joining. Everyone who's writing the comments, I've read every one of them. Thank you so much as well. So perhaps, Vita, you can stop recording, and if people want to just have more intimate discussions, non-recorded, we can definitely do that.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.